Hey everybody, so I know this is a little late. I've been extremely sleep deprived and extremely pressed for time these last couple of days, but with that being said, let's get on with the video. Today we're going to be talking about the builds that I think are the strongest going into the day one final shape raid, Salvation's Edge. Now before we get started, there are a couple things that are of note that I need to mention before we talk about the actual builds themselves. So first, there has been a list of announced disabled items for the day one raid race. I'm not going to link the article because it's fairly short, and I'll just summarize the 4 disabled items here. The first one is Cascade Point. So if you are a Rain of Fire Warlock, there's kind of no point to being on Rain of Fire now, as long as you get your Envious stacks up ahead of time. So as long as you're getting a fair amount of weapon kills, which is fairly easy to do, I will say. So Cascade Point, disabled. You're going to be using Envious Bait and Switch if you choose to use something like Edge Transit. That's number 1. Number 2, Lucky Pants. Final Stand will probably, instead of being Malfeasance or Warden's Law, you're probably going to use something like Still Hunt if you're on Hunter. If you're on Warlock or Titan, you're probably saving a damage super or using maybe Whisper, whatever heavy ammo you have left. The standard stuff, right? Standard stuff. Next up, we have Magnificent Howl. I believe there was a bug that allowed you to infinitely proc Magnificent Howl. You would never run out of those empowered bullets. However, you know, I'm not 100% sure on this, but again, it's disabled. I wasn't going to recommend it anyway, so we'll leave it at that. And finally, Facet of Command, which I believe is the reload fragment for Prismatic. That has also been disabled for whatever reason. I'm not sure why, but it's been disabled. So again, we're not going to talk about it, and we're going to move on because I wasn't going to recommend it anyway. Artifact mods. People have done some testing with these mods, and from what I've gathered so far, Expanding Abyss is less essential than I thought it was. With a Tractor debuff, it appears to be only about a 4 or 5% increase to Void damage. So yes, it still incentivizes people to choose Void when the options are equal, but don't feel, you know, necessarily obligated to pick a Void weapon in this sandbox at this current time with this artifact mod. If you have Void weaken, so it's something like, you know, a Snare Bomb or something like an Undermining Grenade or a Twilight Arsenal weaken, the buff is a little bit bigger. But I would say still, you know, if you're using Tractor, it's still worth, you know, tacking on, but not the most important armor mod in the world, or artifact mod in the world, I should say. Argent Blade, this hasn't been tested extensively. I'm going to assume it's 15%. This is really straightforward. I think the artifact mod situation this day one is fairly straightforward. If you're doing sword damage and you're on Falling Guillotine, stick these 2 on. If you're doing literally anything else, stick these 2 on. Shield Crush, this is like a meta-defining artifact mod. It's just free regen and damage on your abilities just for having buffs, which if you have stuff like Facet of Purpose on, or if you have Radiant Orbs on, you will have buffs all the time. So Shield Crush is excellent. Transference, this is specifically for Transcendence. From what I've seen, Transcendence is about what I expect it to be, meaning it's not meta-defining, game-breaking, anything like that. You also don't get full Transcendence bars when you rally, so you need to charge it up yourself. Now, is it something that I would recommend sacrificing critical fragments for just so you can get it faster? Not really, not really. It is nice. It feels just like an empowered, oh, I can play a little bit more aggressive and not play my life so much type of thing. I guess I suppose it's like a little bit of a decent panic button as well. But besides that, yeah, I don't know. It's not necessarily something you should really struggle with. But if you're talking just neutral gameplay, there's no reason to run something like Expanding Abyss or Argent Blade, or certainly not Prismatic Transfer. So these 2 I think are fine for neutral content. And then in 4th column, Radiant Orbs and Galvanic Armor. Very few exceptions here. I mean, if you're using something like Buried Bloodline, or maybe something like Collective Obligation, again, Void Hegemony is an option, but I think most people aren't really using that. So I would say focus and stick to these 2 mods in the 4th column. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the 3 classes. Now, I'm going to talk about Warlock first, then Hunter, then Titan. Now, I will give you a disclaimer here. I am playing Warlock, so I have not aptly prepared my Hunter and Titan as much as my Warlock. I've just kind of thrown together a sample build in-game. I've obviously put a lot of thought into the actual builds themselves, but I haven't thrown together anything crazy specific with armor mods for Hunter and Titan, just in the interest of time. So first, let's start with Warlock. So Warlock, hate to break it to you guys, you're still going to be on Well of Radiance on this day 1, right? Even if you have multiple Warlocks, I think maybe only having 1 or 2 on Song of Flame is a good idea. If you have like 4 Warlocks or something like that, definitely I would strongly suggest running 2 Wells, right? Well of Radiance is going to be your bread and butter, right? It's going to be the foundation upon which you build by adding DR, by adding boss damage reduction, right? There's a couple things you can do to assist with making Well as survivable as it was before. It's not going to be as low effort as before. Now, in terms of neutral gameplay, I'm going to suggest one of two routes, or one of three routes, I suppose, right? You have three different options. You have two kind of offensive ability spam options in solar grenade spam, fusion grenade spam, and then you have healing grenade spam as well, which is more of a defensive option. So for the first option, Sunbracers, I mean, I love Sunbracers, right? I've been using them for a long time. I'm very comfortable on Sunbracers. That being said, if you're not comfortable on Sunbracers, I would say the safer pick for ability play on this day one, if you want some offense, is going to be Starfire or Verities or Karnstein. Karnstein was an option that was brought up. I'm not completely against it on the fusion grenade build, right? Finally, if you want something more defensive, or maybe you're in an encounter where you can't necessarily kill the ads, or maybe you're doing boss DPS, for example, and you want some defensive support, Speaker's Sight, Mantle of Battle Harmony, and Cenotaph Mask all fit well with the healing grenade spam build, which I'll show you in just a second. Finally, if you're a Divinity user, I have a Prismatic build that automatically applies Sever to the boss, among other things, that I think is good for neutral gameplay. If you are the Divinity user, you can pop your Song of Flame at the start of damage, give all of your allies Radiant. I believe the description also says it gives damage resist. Compendium doesn't seem to include this, so I don't know how much damage resist Song of Flame gives. If no one has that answer by tonight, I will figure it out. I will test that as well, but I believe other people are testing that, so I'll let them test that. But my point is, you can be on Prismatic, you can cast your Song of Flame super, give all of your allies Radiant, possibly give them some damage resist, and then of course you can just div the boss and apply Sever. I think it's better than being on Strand Warlock. If you want to use Thread of Isolation, I would say Facet of Solitude on Prismatic Warlock is better. So again, Divinity users, special build for you. So let's go over these four builds. I have them in game right now. So first up, I have the Sunbracers build. Normally you'd see an edge transit here. It's on another character, so you can kind of ignore that. And yeah, so my fragments, I've listed them all in the spreadsheet here. I kind of don't really need to go over them, but let's go over the differences between some of the builds, because I think that would be a little bit more educational, right? You guys might be requesting dim links for some of these. I mean, listen, you guys can just make these on your own, right? Like, I mean, I have everything listed out here one by one in text form. I will link the spreadsheet for sure down below, but in terms of dim builds, I don't really have time right now, as much as I'd love to make armor mods for all of these different builds and make in-game loadouts. So I've only made them for my Warlock because that's what I'm going to be playing the day one on. But if you want to make your own builds, you're free to just go to the spreadsheet and copy literally everything here. I think armor mods are fairly straightforward. What I've done with my loadouts, a tip for you guys, what I've done with my loadouts is I have a neutral loadout and I have a damage loadout, right? So my neutral loadout, it has reserves. I'm going to rally on reserves, and then before the encounter starts, I'm going to switch to the correct resists, right? So this way, I have flexibility in my loadout, and I'm not hard stuck on certain resists because they're baked into my loadouts. I can choose them at the start of the encounter. And then when it comes to damage, I'm going to place my well, and I'm going to switch to this loadout, which has the stag, right? So some of your loadouts, right, I would suggest having some swap exotics ready. So for example, on Warlock, I have the stag for damage resist, during damage. I have Verity's Brow for roam gameplay, right? I have a Verity's Brow build over here. I have Cenotaph Mask for marking targets being on div. I have Apotheosis Veil. This is kind of like a niche one in case it ends up being useful. I don't think it will be, but have it in my back pocket regardless. I have Aeons in case I need to finish something that someone else is marking. Mantle of Battle Harmony for super farming in certain niche situations. I have Starfire Protocol. I'm not actually planning on using this in neutral gameplay, but I am planning on using it on transition sections. So that's why I have Starfire Protocol. And then I have Rain of Fire for reloads. Again, I'm not using it in any of the builds. I used to have this build, my damage build, has Rain of Fire on it. Not anymore. Lunafaction Boots, in case, probably not going to need it. And then we have Boots of the Assembler, again, in case, probably not going to need it. So those are the exotics that I have packed in my little lunchbox here for Solar Warlock. So yeah, let's go over aspects. I'm kind of getting sidetracked here. Let's go over aspects. You've seen all of the exotics that I recommend. I don't have Speaker's Sight right now. It's in collections. I mean, I can pull it. I'll probably try to get a better roll by the time the day one rolls around. But for now, let's talk about these fragments and aspect decisions. So you'll notice on Sunbracers, I have Heat Touch. I mean, that's kind of a given. You want Touch of Flame so that your solar grenades do more damage to Major's mini-bosses. And then you also want, Heat Rises so that you have access to Phoenix Dive Restoration. I would strongly not recommend running Icarus Dash on Sunbracers on day one. You can run Icarus Dash and not run Touch of Flame. That is an option. But your solar grenades are going to be a little bit weaker. And to be honest, Icarus Dash, you don't really need it inside of a day one encounter for the most part, besides just kind of feeling better about yourself. One thing I do want to comment on is there appears to have been a stealth Empyrean nerf. And it's very, very, very obvious when you play Sunbracers. I don't know why Bungie has not indicated this in their patch notes. Maybe the previous Empyrean nerf didn't go through until now. But I've definitely noticed it playing the Legend campaign, both solo and with Fire Team members. And even if you kill a bunch of ads, your resto just seems to wear out so quickly. And so that was really pissing me off. And so I've actually modified my Sunbracers build to include a mention of Solace, right? Ember of Solace. Now you'll notice, basically, yeah, none of these builds have Ember of Torches. And that's because this season you have Radiant Orbs. You have Radiant Orbs, right? So you don't really need Ember of Torches this season. Now you could argue that it can be used to proc Benevolence, but on the builds where I am using Benevolence, there are 2 sources of proccing Benevolence, right? So you don't really need 3, right? You can pop heat near your teammates using Fusion Grenade or throw a healing grenade at them. You can also Phoenix Dive on them. Both those things will proc Benevolence, and as long as you have high discipline and even just a semi-decent exotic, you will be able to cycle through Benevolence consistently. So I didn't really think the torches was really needed, which is really nice because Solar is a little tight on fragments. So that means minus torches, and you can add something like Solace to Sunbracers, which will make it feel a little bit more consistent. Now, you've also seen the Fusion Grenade build, right? So I also have something for that with Verity's Brow. I'm planning on using this in kind of ad clear encounters where there's majors, for example, something like Exhibition where you have to nuke a Glyph Keeper. Something like this, I think, would appeal pretty nicely to that. Now, the reason why some of the fragments here are different, obviously Benevolence, because Sunbracers, you don't really need your teammates to give you ability regen. You get your melee back from Heat Rises, and of course, you get your Phoenix Dive back kind of from Singeing, and your nades just come back from your melee. You know, Benevolence is not that useful. Now, on these other builds, you do not get your abilities back for free like you do on Sunbracers, right? You don't get free nade spam. And so because of that, Benevolence is basically necessary. That's why it was traded in here. Empyrean's the same. Ashes is on the Fusion Grenade build because in case you are double throwing a Fusion Grenade at target, 2 nades will cause an ignition. Normally without Ashes, that doesn't happen. Solace is to extend the amount, again, to make Empyrean more forgiving here because that Empyrean nerf. And then on this one, obviously, we have Singeing subbed in. This is to prio getting more and more Phoenix Dives and possibly get more Dynamo procs. This is more of a well farming build because it has Mantle of Battle Harmony attached. I tend to perceive Healing Grenade, Phoenix Dive builds as more of well farming builds because obviously your abilities are not going to be the ones that are getting killed. So your helmet mods are not going to be able to contribute besides Dynamo. So yeah, that's my 3 thoughts on the Warlock builds. You have minor ad clear, you have major ad clear, and then you have boss DPS. You can swap to something like the Stag. You can swap to Speaker's Sight. If you're in, debuff, you can be on Cenotaph. And then we have the survivability plus utility build, which I just talked about. And notice how there's no heat rises here because there really doesn't need to be. Your melee is not that valuable here. It's really just spamming Healing Grenade and Phoenix Dive on your teammates repeatedly so that you can proc Benevolence consistently. Okay, Speaker's Sight, something I wanted to talk about because I probably won't get the chance to talk about this in my next video. Speaker's Sight does splash teammates. It also has extremely aggressive tracking. Me and Aqua were doing some testing yesterday in the cistern. He threw a healing turret down and I well skated away and it chased me halfway across the cistern before dissipating and poofing into the air. So it does have a max distance, but the max distance is much, much, much longer than any encounter's kind of radius, width, length, whatever you want to call it. Any radius, any encounter's dimensions. Okay, so Speaker Sight, very, very nice. Now I will say, even if both users have Touch of Flame on, you don't get Resto ×2 unless you are the owner of the turret. Okay, so I will say it's still very, very helpful, right, to have basically constant Resto no matter what you're doing. Excellent neutral exotic, I will say. So definitely a thumbs up from me. The splash radius is also massive. When a projectile hits you, it splashes everyone near you in like basically a well of radiance radius. Okay, so very, very powerful stuff. And finally, the Prismatic build. So the Prismatic build, I'm going to go ahead and show you what I have on, right? So let me go ahead and put that on. I believe that's this one. I have my Strand Rocket Sidearm. I have Divinity. I have a fixed odds machine gun, right? And then obviously right here, I have Song of Flame because I told you I was going to cast that and then start divvying the boss. I have Arcane Needle to unravel the boss because most likely none of my teammates are going to be unraveling the boss. So it's free extra damage. Healing Grenade, neutral. Healing Rift, neutral. Hellion, right? This will help me proc my Devour. It's also just nice to have because when you cast your Rift before damage, you get a free extra little, solar turret damage. I didn't think anything else here was particularly more useful for this build in particular. And then we have Devour. The 5 fragments here, right? Purpose is going to be on every Prismatic build. No need to discuss this. Same thing with Protection on every Prismatic build. And Balance here. Balance here is just for neutral gameplay, right? Just getting my abilities back. Pretty neutral fragment. You'll see it on most Prismatic builds. And then I have Solitude. This is the bread and butter of this build. Basically, if I div a target, it's going to allow me to sever it, reduce its damage output by 40%. Very, very relevant on bosses on day 1. Now that Well of Radiance has been nerfed, you got a lot of that DR gone. This is going to be super helpful. And finally, I have Facet of Hope. I'm always going to have like Radiant or Devour on this build pretty much all the time. And so I just want to get my Healing Rift back faster, get more Hellion, etc., etc. So not a crazy build, not a crazy ability loop or anything, but that is the cost of using Cenotaph and being on Cenotaph on day 1. I think very helpful, and I think certainly better than the Strand build that I had in mind, which also had Isolation. Definitely worse I would say Song of Flame and all of this stuff is a lot more helpful, a lot more sustainable on something like a day one. Okay, so that's it for Warlock. Let's go ahead and move on to Hunter. So let me go ahead and change character. Hunter and Titan, I will say, are probably more simple, because there's really one core build that you're going to be bringing most of the time, unless an encounter is incredibly dangerous. So starting with Hunter, I have two builds, right? We have our Prismatic Hunter, right? And Prismatic Hunter is going to be on Golden Gun. I think you guys have all seen this build by now, but it uses Grapple or Duskfield, Combination Blow, Winter Shroud, Silas Executioner. Now, the reason why this build is so good, right? A lot of you are doubting melee builds. You're like, oh, you know, what if the encounter's kind of dangerous, right? What if the encounter's kind of dangerous? Well, these builds make up for the danger that they put you in by being melee, by having an insane amount of damages. So let me just kind of show you what's going on here. Winter Shroud, every time you dodge, you get damage resist. So that's number one. You get damage resist from that. Number two, you have Facet of Protection. That also gives you damage resist when you're surrounded, which is when you're in danger, aka meleeing things. So that's number two, Facet of Protection. Number three, you have Galvanic Armor. You're going to be amplified all the time on this build because you are repeatedly getting arc kills with Combination Blow. And as you guys know, Prismatic inherits the arc subclass behavior, where if you get multiple arc kills, you get amplified. So you will always have amplified DR in that way. You can pair this with stuff like Certarachne's Facade and Facet of Purpose. Facet of Purpose, if you are on Solar, you'll get Resto from your orbs. If you're on Void and you're on Tether, you will get Void Overshield from your orbs. If you're on Strand, or if you have Silk Strike, or if you have Silence and Squall, you can stack Frost Armor, you can stack Certarachne's Facade, right? You can get Woven Mail, and you can get Gifted Conviction, which also stacks, which is also like 50% DR on top of all of this, if you have something like a Volt Shot Sidearm. So again, you're basically stacking 4 sources of DR, and none of them are inconsistent. These are all things you're basically going to be proccing just by playing the subclass normally. You don't have to do anything special. And so as a result, as long as you have your buffs up and you are even just vaguely aware of how to play this build, aka dodge punch, whatever, right? As long as you are vaguely aware of how to play this build, you will have a ton of damage resist. It'll be incredibly difficult for a boss to kill you or enemies to kill you, even on a day one, right? So pretty strong stuff. Now let's talk about these exotics real quick. We'll move on to the fragments and why I have Hope Bravery, and then we'll talk about some swap stuff. So in terms of your exotics, I think most people have landed on one of these three. Renewal feels a bit weak on this subclass because Prismatic doesn't really have a strong way of getting your grenade back consistently. The grenade also doesn't last very long without Whisper of Durance. You don't have Whisper of Shards on this subclass. So I think most people have landed on one of these three. Liar's Handshake, right? Good for doing sustained damage to a target, right? But again, probably not that relevant on a day one. You're not going to be punching a boss with this on day one. Not too much, I think. Or I would hope not. You have Certarachne's Facade. This is a great way to get Woven Mail without having to interact with any enemies. You can begin your engagement by grappling into some targets. That will proc your Stylish. It will also give you Woven Mail right off the bat, right? So a big problem with these melee builds is a lot of them require you to stack up some effect, and then that effect requires some initial risk taking, some initial risk investment. Certarachne says, to hell with that, I'll give you 45% DR right off the rip. So that's pretty good. And finally, we have Gifted Conviction. Now, Gifted Conviction, if you pair this with a Volt Shot weapon, like an Indebted Kindness, it's basically a more safe version where you can get an additional, on top of all the damages you're already getting. So potentially Restoration, or Void Overshield DR, or Woven Mail, or Frost Armor, plus Facet of Protection, plus Amplified DR from Galvanic Armor, plus Winter Shroud DR. On top of all of that, if you want even more damage resist, an even more protected option is going to be Gifted Conviction, right? So again, all these things, very, very, like a lot of damage resist packed into this, right? As long as you're consistently getting melee kills, which should be fairly easy with this build. Again, invisibility too, like this thing is just loaded. This is Assassin's Cowl Arc Hunter, but on crack, and with less splash damage. Obviously, when the exotic class items come out, be a little bit stronger with stuff like, you know, Caliban, Spirit of Caliban. But for the most part, still strong enough, I would say, to be used in a day one, okay? As for your other exotics, you have Celestial Nighthawk, you have Orpheus Rig, you have Aeon Swift. Celestial Nighthawk, obviously you're going to swap to that for DPS, right? No kind of issues with here. I mean, you can swap your class ability if you really want to, but I would probably just not bother. You have Orpheus Rig. If you're on Tether, you can use Orpheus Rig to get your Tether back off of enemy kills. If you're going to use this in something like neutral gameplay, in something like a roaming counter, where you don't necessarily want to be on Celestial Nighthawk because you're not doing boss DPS, you'd rather control a room, Orpheus Rig is good for that. And then Aeon Swift, in case you need to make heavy ammo for your teammates. And yeah, that's pretty much it. These fragments, you'll largely recognize them. On melee-focused, ability and damage-focused builds, you're always going to have Facet of Courage. These two are a given, right? Courage just increases ability damage to dark debuffed enemies, which if you're dodging near them and slowing them, you're going to be debuffing them with slow, which is a dark debuff. We have Sacrifice. This will allow you to get a little bit more dark Transcendence energy, because on this build, you're going to be getting a lot of light Transcendence energy because you're using Combination Blow. So this will allow you to be a little bit more kind of balanced in your Transcendence gain. And then finally, we have Hope and Bravery. I'm generally going to say Hope is better here. Bravery allows you to get Unraveling or Volatile rounds on the 121 shotgun or whatever weapon you choose to use, which can be kind of helpful for anti-barrier. But for the most part, I probably wouldn't recommend this because you have Radiant Orbs this season, so not even necessary. Hope is nice because if in case you ever dodge by accident and there's no enemies near you, don't get your melee back, you're sitting there without any abilities, this will just make sure that you have some sort of class regen scaler, because a big part of Arc Hunter, the nice recovery loop, was that if you had Amplified and you had Flow State, it increased your ability regen for your class ability. So having Hope here is kind of like a substitute for that, allows you to get a little bit of class ability regen in case you accidentally use your dodge. I went over all the other fragments. They didn't really make sense to me. They weren't really better than this. These 5 were kind of the obvious ones. So yeah, that is going to be the Hunter build. Next up, we have another Hunter build. Now, this is specifically for boss DPS, okay? I've heard rumors, and again, I haven't tested Silence and Squall. You'll see that in the next video, which is probably coming tonight or tomorrow morning. But Silence and Squall is, I've heard, better total damage now, right? It has improved with the shatter damage changes. And so as a result, you can probably use this over something like Prismatic Hunter in an encounter where maybe you're sorting the boss, right? Or maybe a boss is incredibly dangerous and you need that frost armor for your team to protect yourselves in that well. Then I think Renewal Grasp and being on stasis specifically is going to be strong. Now, the reason I say this is because remember, when I said Renewal felt weak on Prismatic Hunter, it's because you don't have access to stuff like Durance. You don't get the crystal in the middle, right? You don't get Whisper of Shards, right? And so because of that, I'm really going to strongly suggest if you want to give your teammates DR, you want to play a supportive role, Stasis Hunter is probably going to be the play, right? Renewal Grasp, right? You give your teammates DR, you reduce the boss's damage output, you're basically guaranteed to get a grenade back with post-buff Torment, right? You have additional DR for yourself because of Rhyme. So really strong stuff here. You have Shards, you're going to get your grenade back during damage. Just excellent stuff here for boss DPS. Now, a build that I haven't listed here, right? In case, for whatever reason, right, these boss encounters are so dangerous or there's something about them where you really need to go back to basics. I'm also going to give an honorable mention to Gerfalcons on Void Hunter, right? Because Gerfalcons on Void Hunter, you have Invisibility, you have Devour. I haven't listed it here, but I would suggest if you are playing Hunter, which I'm not playing Hunter, but if you are playing Hunter, you don't have a lot of loadout slots because this is just 2 loadouts, right? And maybe you have some extra loadouts maybe for Aeons or whatever. So you're not using that many loadout slots. If you want to fill out your loadout slots with maybe something that could potentially come in handy, maybe set up a Void Hunter build with Orpheus swap, Gerfalcons, some sort of Void weapon like Graviton or whatever, and then have it as a defensive fallback option, maybe with Omni as well, right? In case there's some encounter where Void Hunter, specifically Void Hunter and not Prismatic Hunter on Tether, is going to be useful, right? Now, again, I have my doubts. I think these 2 are certainly strong enough, right? People are going to criticize this for being a melee build. Some of the day 1 raiders, hardcore day 1 raiders are probably going to criticize this for being a melee build. But again, this build is extremely strong because even in its individual elements, you can play far back with this build. You don't have to use the melee part of this build. And it's still a very, very strong build regardless, right? You still have stuff like 50% DR from Gifted Conviction. If you're getting repeated arc kills with an arc weapon like a Volt Shot Sidearm, you will be getting Galvanic Armor, right? You will be getting Resto on Orb Pickup. You will be getting Stylus Executioner procs even from far away as long as you are slowing the enemies or debuffing them in some way. And so this can be played far back or it can be played up close, right? And I would argue either way, I think it is better than Solar Hunter in general. Okay, so moving on, finally, let's talk about Titan. So Titan, I was kind of unsure of this because I saw Prismatic Hunter and I was like, even if the grapple thing doesn't work out, which it kind of hasn't really worked out because grapple melee doesn't stack with combination blow, it's still going to be really strong, right? Stylish, Winter Shroud, very strong build, right? Titan, I wasn't so sure because Titan, it looks like it kind of lacks sustain options, like the damage looks to be there, but after hearing the positive feedback from one of my Titan teammates who's been playing this, plans on bringing it into the day 1, Knockout Consecration is very strong, right? First off, right off the rip, when you rally, you get 3 consecrations, right? Just 3 consecrations right off the rip. One of the stronger melee damage abilities in the game. One of the strongest splash melee damage abilities in the game, right? Now, you also have Knockout. Knockout will allow you to get Amplified DR. So if Galvanic Armor, which we talked about already, you can proc it on Titan, right? Warlock is really the only class that maybe has some difficulty getting access to Galvanic DR because you're on Solar, right? So you're going to get Amplified every time you get Arc multi-kills because you're on Knockout, right? It'll proc that when you get a melee kill. And then on top of that, right, you get health back every time you kill a cluster of enemies because it counts as a melee kill, right? And then you have Shackle to suspend enemies, which will then proc Courage, which will increase your consecration damage even further. Now, a build I was experimenting with was replacing Knockout with something like Drenger's Lash and using Abeyant Leap, so that every time you suspend enemies, you get free Woven Mail, which is a little bit more sustained. But then, I don't know, I don't know, this build is just so offensively strong, and the DR that's baked in is kind of already good enough that you don't really need the free Woven Mail from Suspend. It's kind of the equivalent of running Surturacnes on Hunter, except the thing about Hunter is that the grenade is probably the least useful thing on Prismatic Hunter, and so it's kind of not really a loss to run Surturacnes. But on on Prismatic Titan, you're losing Synthos. You're losing Synthos if you if you choose to run something like Abeyant Leap. So I would say the offensive presence, I think Synthos is really just going to be the core exotic. We're going to explore Hazardous Propulsion for damage. We're going to explore Curus of the Falling Star for damage. I've heard people talk about Twilight Arsenal. One of my teammates asked me to test it out. I tested it out just now on Templar. It doesn't appear to be that great. I mean, if you have a Tractor user and you want to extend Tractor safely by using Twilight Arsenal, that is certainly an option that is available to you. So maybe keep that in your back pocket. But I would say, is it one of the default things you should run? Not really, right? Now, the nice thing about Prismatic Titan and Prismatic in general is that you can really just change your super if you need more sustain, right? Because none of the supers that are attached, like Silence and Squall, Golden Gun, Blade Fury, Hammer of Soul, Thunder Crash, none of these supers are horrible on a day one. They're not horrible. And so if you feel that maybe you're on, Thunder Crash Titan, and you feel that, I feel like I need like a little bit more DR, I feel like I need a little bit more sustain, you can just swap to Blade Fury. You can just swap to Blade Fury. You'll lose out on a stronger damage super, but every time you pick up an orb, you'll get Woven Mail, right? So you can really just flex your super. It's kind of surprising, right? Because your super tends to be something that people think is very essential to a build, but a lot of the time when I'm picking supers on Prismatic, I'm thinking about Facet of Purpose. Facet of Purpose, right? That's the one where you pick up an orb, and depending on your equipped super, you get a different effect, right? And so I'm thinking, if I want Woven Mail, I'll pick a Strand super, even if the Strand super is not that strong. So it's kind of interesting how the approach has kind of gone backwards on Prismatic, right? You pick a super to serve the fragments rather than having the super be the original choice, the subclass choice, and then you pick fragments to match the super, right? So kind of interesting paradigm there. Regardless, I think this build is fairly straightforward, right? You literally just go consecrate shit, right? Consecrate shit. You can play far back if you want to, right? Knockout works on low HP enemies, right? You can use it. You can build into your grenade. You can shackle stuff. But I still think, regardless, Prismatic Titan has the strongest mix of offense and defense on day one. Now, I will say, remember, I have defensive fallback builds, right? There's some day one raiders out there who are just bread and butter, right? They're going to go for something like Solar Titan. And if you want to use Solar Titan to have access to something like Healing Grenade, to nuke down majors, to make sunspots everywhere, if that's more of your thing, that's in your comfort zone, I'm not going to say that's bad for day one or something like that, right? That is certainly an option. I haven't listed it here because it's not novel. On this list, I wanted to list stuff that is basically new. That is new or so fundamental that it's very much the obvious choice, right? Stuff like this, right? But I would say all of this stuff is largely pretty new, right? I mean, this is pretty new. I mean, it's Prismatic. This is new. Most of the time, people don't talk about using these in the day one, right? So I think all of this is pretty novel. I mean, if you want to go back to the classics and run something like Solar Titan on Synthos, that is totally fine, right? You'll totally be served well by that. Again, it's more of a comfort pick, so that's really up to you. But again, I'm not going to talk about that build here because I think everyone and their mother knows how that build works and how to build it. So I'm not going to put it on the spreadsheet. So anyways, back to Prismatic Titan. The other Prismatic Titan build that I'm going to recommend. So we obviously I have kind of three categories here when it comes to builds, right? I have ability damage, so offense. I have defense during DPS, so stuff like Speaker Sight, stuff like the Stag, stuff like Renewal Grass, and in this case, it's going to be Ursa Furiosa. So Ursa Furiosa, this build is easily the weakest of the bunch here, right? It doesn't have a lot of strong access to healing. Its Devour access is questionable. Its abilities in terms of offense are not very strong, right? So it's easily the weakest one here, but Banner Shield is kind of irreplaceable on a day one in its primary function. And so if we ever encounter a boss on day one that is so dangerous and is projectile based, then Banner Shield is something that you may want to consider. And Ursa Furiosa also synergizes with Unbreakable and gives you super energy back for your Banner Shield. So that can be particularly helpful. You're really just going to run something like a Void Weapon and maybe something with Repulsor Brace so that you have access to Offensive Bulwark. Now, Void Titan is going to be lacking the Void Overshield pickup on orbs and stuff like that. But again, you do have access to Devour. You have access to Invis Finisher if you want to swap to Aeons. You have access to Echo of Reprisal to get your Banner Shield back faster. But this is really just a niche pick in case a boss really necessitates the use of something like a Banner Shield. Okay, so that is pretty much it. In terms of fragment choices, I'm not going to go over these too much. I mean, I think prismatic fragments are fairly straightforward. I don't think building into transcendent... I mean, all of the transcendent fragments that require you to like build into them are kind of a waste compared to how good some of these other fragments are, right? I think purpose protection should be on basically every prismatic build. You have stuff like balance, which is just neutral, free ability energy back. You have stuff like sacrifice, because a lot of the time you're getting light ability kills, not dark ability kills, and so you want to balance that out by giving yourself more transcendent energy. This is the one thing I'll permit, right? Hope is decent for class ability regen on classes that, you know, prefer getting class ability regen, so basically Hunter and Warlock here. And then courage is for ability damage, right? And then solitude is for my prismatic warlock that uses cenotaph. So I hope this all made sense, right? I mean, I think the build crafting this time around, I think it's fairly obvious what the strongest offensive ability builds are right now. You know, come the raid being over and Act 1 is out, Echoes is out, and we're able to get our exotic class items. Obviously, these will grow a lot stronger, but it is my opinion at this time that these builds are the strongest in the game for even something like a day one scenario where consistency is favored over potency. These just have so much DR packed into them, and we have so much weapon support that you can afford to play far back on these aggressive builds, and you will still get stuff done, right? Stuff like, you know, Red Death, stuff like Heal Clip Pulses, Heal Clip Sidearms. We just have so much utility now in the sandbox that you can really be very flexible with these prismatic builds and not have to swap too much for stuff like doing boss DPS or maybe more dangerous encounters. So with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm now going to enter probably a 9 or 10 hour damage testing session. Hopefully we'll have a video or something like that for you at the end of this. And yeah, I'll catch you guys later. Remember, spreadsheet is linked in the description if you want to copy the builds. And yeah, good luck to all of you that are participating in the day one.